In one of Detroit's forgotten neighborhoods, 9-year-old Ethan Miller spends his afternoons scavenging scrap metal to buy medicine for his grandmother. But everything changes the day he finds a well-dressed man lying unconscious in the trash. The stranger has no memory of who he is, only a luxury watch engraved with initials he can't recognize. Ethan's simple act of kindness sets off a chain of events that will reshape both of their lives forever. In the forgotten outskirts of Detroit, where abandoned factories tower like rusted monuments to a better past, 9-year-old Ethan Miller begins each morning with a purpose far too heavy for a child his age. The neighborhood is a maze of cracked pavements, boarded-up houses, and streetlights that haven't worked in years. Most kids in other parts of the city wake up thinking about video games, school lunches, or weekend plans. But Ethan wakes up thinking about copper wire, aluminum cans, and whatever metal he can gather before sunset. His world is built around survival and responsibility, shaped by the fragile health of the only family he has left, his grandmother Helen. Ethan pushes his squeaky little wagon down the narrow streets, always keeping an eye out for anything he can salvage. His gloves are too big, donated by a neighbor, and his shoes have a hole in one toe, but he moves with determination. He knows that every pound of metal he finds can mean the difference between buying his grandmother's blood pressure medication or going another night hoping her heartbeat stays steady. Helen used to be strong, the kind of grandmother who could carry groceries up 2 flights of stairs and bake pies at the same time. But years of hard work, inconsistent health care, and the stress of raising a child alone have worn her body down. On the mornings when she feels too weak to stand, Ethan leaves her a cup of tea on the nightstand before heading out, whispering promises he fully intends to keep, promises that no child should ever have to make. Detroit's East Side is not the Detroit from tourist brochures. It is a part of the city where buses pass only when they feel like it, where people earn their honesty through struggle, and where abandoned cars become part of the landscape. Ethan knows every alley, every empty lot, every hidden corner where people toss old appliances or scrap metal. He's small and quick, able to crawl into tight spaces adults can't reach. That makes him valuable in this unspoken economy of collecting and selling metal, though he doesn't do it for money in his pocket. He does it because the pharmacy doesn't take ice. Ethan learned early that just hoping things will get better never changes anything, so he learned to work quietly, tirelessly, and with a kind of resilience that makes older neighbors shake their heads in awe. Adults often ask him where his parents are, but he never answers. He doesn't know, and the not knowing is a bruise he learned not to touch. All he has is Helen, and all Helen has is him. Most days, Ethan walks past a massive abandoned auto plant that casts a long shadow across the neighborhood. Vines crawl over the broken windows, graffiti climbs up the walls, and stray cats slip in and out like ghosts. To others, it's a symbol of decay, but to Ethan, it's a treasure map. Old machinery sometimes gets dumped nearby, the kind rich companies don't bother disposing of properly. That machinery is heavy, but with enough persistence, Ethan can take it apart piece by piece. He loves the satisfying clink of metal landing in his wagon, a sound that means he's one step closer to paying for another week of medicine. The scrapyard owner, Mr. Lawson, a gruff man with oil-stained hands, always pays Ethan fairly, more fairly than he pays adults. Kid works harder than half the grown men I know, he mutters whenever Ethan shows up. Ethan never responds, only nods respectfully, because every minute he spends talking is a minute he could be collecting. Despite everything, he is still a child, curious, observant, and full of questions he rarely voices. He wonders what life is like in the nice areas of Detroit where lawns are trimmed and houses have working AC. He wonders what it would feel like to have a backpack full of school supplies instead of a wagon full of rusted metal. He wonders why nobody seems to fix things anymore, houses, streets, cars. People. He wonders most of all why the world feels so divided. Yet he never complains. Complaining doesn't buy medicine. Complaining doesn't keep Helen breathing steadily at night. So Ethan carries his burden without expecting anyone to lighten it. One chilly morning, as the wind sweeps through the neighborhood carrying the scent of rain and old steel, Ethan starts his usual route earlier than normal. Helen had spent most of the night coughing, and he could hear the strain in her breathing even after the coughing stopped. He knew she needed her pill refill immediately. The pharmacy bill sat on the table, a reminder that he was running out of time. With determination tightening his small shoulders, Ethan navigates toward the old railway tracks behind the abandoned plant. People rarely go there except to dump trash, and that makes it one of his most reliable spots. He climbs over a fallen fence panel, wheels his wagon across the uneven ground, and keeps his eyes low, scanning for glimmers of metal. Ethan's world is quieter out here, no cars, no shouting, no neighbors sweeping porches or arguing over bills. Just the wind, the crunch of debris under his shoes, and the distant rumble of the city. Sometimes he feels like he's the only kid in Detroit who knows this place exists, this hidden borderland between abandonment and possibility. To him it's almost peaceful. Not comforting but familiar in a way that makes him feel oddly safe. As he walks, he thinks about how life used to be when Helen was healthier. She would pack him small lunches, teach him old songs, and show him how to fix broken things. Everything can be repaired, she would say as she mended torn shirts or glued cracked dishes. Ethan believed her then. He still tries to believe it now, especially on days when the world feels too big and too broken. He thinks of her words as he searches the dirt, hoping to find enough metal to keep her going a little longer. But lately even scrap metal has been harder to come by. More people have turned to scavenging, competing for the same scraps that used to be easy to find. Ethan is faster than most, but competition makes everything unpredictable. Still, he doesn't give up. Giving up isn't an option, not when the stakes are survival. What Ethan doesn't know, as he searches near the old freight platform, is that his life is about to collide with a world completely unlike his own. A world of wealth, betrayal, and secrets buried much deeper than any piece of metal he has ever dug up. He doesn't yet know that his kindness and determination, traits forged in poverty, are about to change the fate of someone powerful. Nor does he know that in just a few moments, he will find something that is not metal, not machinery, not scrap, but a man. A man who appears completely out of place in this forgotten corner of Detroit. A man whose presence will alter the course of Ethan's entire life. He only knows that he needs to keep searching, keep pushing forward, keep fighting for the grandmother who raised him. And as he moves through the debris, his little wagon rattling behind him, he steps unknowingly toward the moment that will transform everything he thinks he knows about the world. Ethan had explored that stretch behind the abandoned railway platform 100 times, yet on this particular chilly afternoon, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the clouds hung low, almost pressing down on the earth. Or maybe it was the unusual hush settling over the old freight yard. Ethan dragged his wagon through the uneven gravel, expecting to find the usual tossed appliances or twisted metal strips he could take apart later. But what caught his eye this time wasn't metal, it was the unexpected shape of a person lying awkwardly near a mound of trash bags and broken pallets. For a moment he froze, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him. People didn't usually come out here unless they were looking for trouble or trying to get away from it. But the figure didn't move, didn't even twitch, and Ethan felt a spike of worry push him forward despite every instinct telling him to turn around. The man lay on his side, one leg partially buried in debris, his suit jacket torn and smeared with dirt. Ethan had seen men in suits before, lawyers hustling downtown, businessmen rushing between cars, but he had never seen one anywhere near this part of Detroit. Certainly not thrown out like garbage. The contrast stunned him. His neighborhood was filled with workers in old t-shirts, hoodies, and construction boots. Not immaculate suits, probably worth more than everything inside Ethan's house combined. Ethan stepped closer, gripping the handle of his wagon tightly, studying the stranger's shoes first. They were polished leather, expensive looking, though now scratched and dusty from the rough ground. No one around here wore shoes like that. No one around here owned anything like that. Ethan hesitated before taking another step. Adults, especially unknown ones, had always been a risk. Helen had drilled that lesson into him from the time he was old enough to cross the street alone. But the man didn't look like someone who came here to cause harm. He looked like someone who didn't belong at all, someone who had stumbled into the wrong part of the city and paid for it. The man's face was half covered by his arm, but Ethan could see the outline of sharp cheekbones and trimmed facial hair beneath streaks of grime. His hair was dark, neatly cut, definitely not the style of anyone living in this neighborhood. A slight fear prickled at the back of Ethan's neck, but something stronger than fear nudged him forward: curiosity, worry, and maybe a little of that reckless courage kids sometimes have because they don't yet understand all the dangers in the world. He crouched cautiously and reached out, not quite touching the man, but close enough to feel warmth radiating from his shoulder. A wave of relief washed over him. At least the man wasn't dead. The thought of finding a corpse made Ethan's stomach twist uncomfortably. He cleared his throat, hoping the sound might stir the stranger awake. "Sir," he whispered, his small voice nearly swallowed by the wind. When there was no reaction, he tried again, louder. "Hey, are you okay?" The man's eyelids fluttered faintly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to convince Ethan that he had to do something. Leaving the man here felt wrong. Even in a neighborhood where people had to fend for themselves, where everyone carried their own burdens and no one expected help from strangers, Ethan couldn't just walk away. Finally, driven by instinct more than logic, Ethan nudged the man's arm gently. The man groaned a strained and hoarse sound, and turned his head slightly, revealing more of his face. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his forehead bore a bruise blooming in deep purples and reds. Ethan watched anxiously as the man's eyes parted. They were an unusual shade gray with a flicker of confusion bouncing inside them. The man blinked as though trying to focus, struggling to understand where he was. His breathing was uneven, shallow but consistent, and Ethan could see the tension in his jaw as he attempted to lift himself. "Don't move too fast," Ethan said quickly. He didn't know if the advice was useful, but it felt like the right thing to say. The man tried anyway, pushing against the ground with his hands. He managed to shift upward, sitting halfway before collapsing back against a broken pallet. Ethan reached out to steady him, his small hands awkwardly supporting the stranger's shoulder. The man's gaze drifted around the empty yard, his expression tightening as he took in the decay and the scattered piles of garbage. Where he murmured, his voice rough like gravel. He tried again but couldn't seem to form a complete thought. It was clear he was disoriented, lost in both place and memory. When his eyes settled on Ethan, they brightened slightly, acknowledging the presence of another human being. "Kid, what happened?" he asked weakly. Ethan shook his head. "I just found you here." He looked around quickly to make sure no one else was nearby. In places like this, the wrong eyes spotting a wealthy-looking man could lead to trouble fast. "You shouldn't be here," Ethan added, though the man probably already knew that. The stranger pulled in a shaky breath and attempted to stand again, but his legs trembled beneath him. Ethan grabbed his arm. "Don't," he urged. "You re-hurt." The man's hand drifted clumsily to his temple as if testing for injuries. His fingers touched the swollen bruise, and he winced. Ethan noticed something glinting on the man's wrist, a watch, sleek and polished, untouched despite everything else being torn or dirty. It was the kind of watch only people with money wore, the kind of thing you never saw in his neighborhood unless someone had stolen it. The band was engraved with elegant lettering. Ethan couldn't read the words from where he knelt, but he knew enough to recognize it was more than anything he could ever collect in scrap metal. The watch seemed out of place here, shining like a shard of another world dropped into this forgotten corner. A thought flickered across Ethan's mind. Whoever this man was, he came from a life far removed from his own. The realization almost made Ethan step backward, as though he had stumbled onto something too big, too strange for him to handle. But the man's labored breathing kept him rooted in place. Whatever his story was, right now he was just a person who desperately needed help. Ethan swallowed hard, thinking of Helen. She always said, "Do what's right even when it scares you," and this moment fit the description perfectly. "Sir," he said softly, "you need to get out of here. This place gets worse when the sun goes down." The man blinked again as if trying to process the words, then nodded weakly. "Help me stand," he rasped. It took all of Ethan's strength to brace him, pulling one arm around his shoulder. The man leaned heavily against him, his weight nearly toppling them both. Step by shaky step, they began moving toward the broken fence that led back to the street. Ethan had no idea how he was going to explain this to Helen or what danger he might be bringing home. But the thought of leaving the man behind wasn't an option he could live with. The stranger stumbled, clutching Ethan's shoulder tighter, and in that moment Ethan felt the full gravity of the situation settle on his small frame. Whatever happened next, this was the moment that would change everything. They were now connected, one kid fighting to survive each day, and one mysterious man whose very presence hinted at a life far more complicated than anything Ethan had ever known. And as they limped slowly toward the fading daylight, Ethan sensed deep inside that nothing about his world would ever be the same again. Ethan struggled under the man's weight as they made their way through the narrow path behind the rail yard. The stranger's arms slung heavily around his shoulders. Every few steps, the man stumbled, forcing Ethan to adjust his footing to keep both of them from collapsing. He wasn't used to supporting an adult, especially someone who clearly stood half a foot over most men Ethan had seen in the neighborhood. His breath came out in small huffs, but he didn't stop. The sooner he could get the man somewhere safe, the better. The air grew colder as the afternoon faded, and Ethan knew he couldn't risk staying outside for long. Nightfall in this part of Detroit wasn't something you waited around for. He guided the stranger through the broken fence panel, dragging his wagon behind him with his free hand. The wagon rattled loudly across the uneven street, wheels squeaking with every bump. Normally, Ethan would have tried to be quiet, to avoid drawing attention to himself or whatever he was carrying, but right now, noise didn't matter. All that mattered was getting this man away from the yard before anyone else came snooping around. The stranger breathed unevenly, his head drooping as he fought to stay conscious. Ethan glanced up at him continuously, worried the man would pass out and fall again. "Just a little more," he said, trying to sound confident even though his voice trembled slightly. "My house is close. My grandma, she can help." The man didn't respond in words, but he managed a weak nod that told Ethan he was at least hearing the boy's voice through the haze. They turned onto the residential street where Ethan lived, a cluster of aging homes that leaned forward like tired elders. Shingles were missing on half the roofs, windows were patched with plastic, and lawns had long surrendered to weeds. But to Ethan, this place was home, and right now it was the only safe place he could bring the stranger. As they approached his small house, more a sagging wooden box than a home, Ethan felt a mix of dread and urgency churn inside his chest. He had no idea how Helan would react to him dragging in a grown man from the railroad yard, especially one dressed like he came from a completely different world. Helan was kind, but she had spent enough years in this neighborhood to know danger often arrived wearing expensive shoes and clean shirts. She had taught Ethan to be careful, to be suspicious, to keep his distance from people who didn't belong. And the man currently leaning on Ethan's shoulder definitely didn't belong. Still, Ethan couldn't imagine leaving him behind. He'd spent too long watching people ignore others, suffering to ever do that himself. He helped the man up the short, crooked steps and pushed open the front door. The living room was dim, lit only by the weak light sneaking in through the curtains. The heater rattled in the corner, doing its best to warm the space even though it was older than Ethan himself. Helan appeared from the hallway, her gray hair pulled back loosely and her face drawn with fatigue. She had probably just gotten up from the bed where she rested most afternoons. Her tired eyes widened when she saw Ethan half carrying a stranger into the house. "Ethan Miller, what on earth?" she began, her voice sharp with alarm. Ethan didn't give her a chance to continue. "Grandma, I found him at the yard by the tracks," he said quickly, guiding the man toward the couch. "He was hurt. He could barely move. I couldn't just leave him there." Helan's eyes darted between Ethan and the stranger, taking in the man's expensive clothing, the dirt smeared across his face, and the way his body sagged heavily onto the worn-out couch cushions. She approached cautiously, her jaw tightening in concern and suspicion. "Sir," she said, leaning forward slightly but keeping her distance, "can you hear me?" The man struggled to sit upright, bracing himself with his hands. Yes," he said weakly. His voice was hoarse, as if every word scraped against his throat. "Thank you for the help." He looked around in confusion, his gaze trying to make sense of the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where am I?" Ethan sat beside him, still breathless from the effort of carrying him. "This is my house," he said. "I found you by the tracks. You were hurt, and you didn't know what happened." The man rubbed his forehead, wincing as he touched the bruise there. I don't remember how I got there." Helan crossed her arms, studying him carefully. "What's your name, sir?" she asked. The man opened his mouth, then paused. Confusion flickered across his face like a shadow passing over glass. "I don't know," he muttered, his brows furrowing deeply. Ethan's heart sank. "You don't remember your name?" The man shook his head slowly, visibly frustrated. "Everything feels foggy. I remember nothing before waking up there, nothing." Helan exchanged a worried glance with Ethan before kneeling slightly in front of the stranger. "This is not a place where people in suits just happen to lose their memory," she said. Her voice was firm, but underneath it was a note of concern she couldn't fully hide. "Did someone hurt you?" The man closed his eyes as if trying to draw images from the blank spaces in his mind. After several seconds, he opened them again and shook his head. "I don't know." Helan sighed and stood up, pressing a hand to her lower back. She had seen her share of trouble in this neighborhood: lost souls, injured men, people running from something. But this situation felt different. This man didn't look like someone who belonged to the streets or the violence that sometimes spilled across them. He looked like someone who came from a world of offices, money, polished cars, and secure buildings, someone who should never have ended up unconscious behind a railroad yard. "Ethan," she said finally, "get him some water." Ethan hurried to the kitchen, grateful for something to do. His hands trembled slightly as he filled a glass from the tap. His mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Why was he here? What had happened to him? When he returned, the man accepted the water with shaky hands, sipping slowly as if the act took effort. Helan watched him closely, weighing possibilities in her mind. After a long pause, she spoke again. "Sir, you can stay here tonight," she said reluctantly, "but only tonight. Tomorrow we will figure out who you are and where you belong." The man nodded gratefully. "Thank you," he whispered. Ethan felt a small wave of relief wash over him. The man wasn't safe. Not really, not with no memory and mysterious injuries, but he was safer than he had been on the ground behind the rail yard. And for now, that was enough. As evening settled over the small house, Ethan pulled up a chair near the couch, watching the stranger drift into an uneasy sleep. He didn't know why he felt responsible for the man, but something deep inside told him this moment mattered. That helping this stranger would become something far bigger than either of them understood. And as the old heater hummed in the background, Ethan wondered how a man dressed in a suit had ended up broken lost in a place like this, and what would happen when his memory finally returned. Helen didn't sleep much that night, though she pretended to. She sat in her old rocking chair long after Ethan had gone to bed, her eyes fixed on the stranger resting uneasily on the couch. The dim lamp cast a warm glow over the room, highlighting the sharp contrast between the man's expensive clothing and the worn-out blankets she had draped over him. She didn't trust him, how could she? People didn't simply appear unconscious in a Detroit rail yard without a story behind it, and stories like that rarely came without trouble to follow. But she couldn't shake the small tug of compassion she felt either. It was the same feeling she had each time she found an abandoned stray animal near the alley or when a desperate neighbor knocked on her door asking for help. Her heart had always been soft even when life tried to harden it. That softness, however, didn't outweigh caution. Not here. Not anymore. She watched the stranger breathe, noticing how his chest rose unevenly. He muttered once or twice under his breath, the words too faint and distorted to understand. The bruise on his forehead had deepened, spreading a darker shade of purple that worried her. A head injury was nothing to dismiss. Still, what unsettled her the most wasn't his injury, it was the watch on his wrist. She had caught a clear look at it earlier, and it wasn't something a man from her neighborhood could afford. The metal, the engraving, the craftsmanship, it all screamed money, wealth beyond anything that belonged on their block. She didn't need much imagination to picture how a man with a watch like that could end up in danger. People with money always had enemies, and enemies had a nasty way of reaching across worlds. Across the room, Ethan slept curled up in the old recliner. He had refused to go into his own room, insisting on staying where he could keep an eye on the stranger just in case. Helen hadn't had the heart to argue. She knew the boy cared deeply and fiercely, sometimes more than was good for him. His instinct to help others was beautiful, but she feared it might one day hurt him. She had raised him to be kind, but had hoped the world would teach him caution before it taught him heartbreak. Yet Ethan had a way of seeing the good in people long before the danger, and she couldn't deny that the stranger might need help. When dawn crept into the room, pale and tired, Helen rose slowly from her chair. Her joints protested as she stood, but she moved quietly toward the kitchen to start coffee. The scent of ground beans filled the air, earthy and comforting. As she poured water into the machine, she heard movement from the living room. The stranger was trying to sit up again, bracing himself awkwardly with one hand on the back of the couch. She walked over slowly, then stopped a few steps away, folding her arms once more. "You shouldn't be moving too much," she said. The man looked up at her, his eyes still clouded with exhaustion and confusion. "I didn't want to sleep too long," he murmured. "I didn't want to impose." Helen raised an eyebrow. "You didn't exactly walk through my door on your own, so you can relax. You not imposing. You a puzzle I haven't figured out yet." The man gave her a faint, bewildered look, as though unsure how to respond to that. She pulled a chair over and sat down, leaning slightly forward. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "Let's try this again. What's the last thing you remember before waking up in that yard?" He closed his eyes briefly, concentrating. His brow tightened in frustration. "Nothing," he whispered eventually. "It's just blank. I keep trying to reach for something, but it feels like grabbing smoke." Helen studied him carefully, searching his face for signs of deceit. People lied for many reasons: fear, guilt, self-preservation, but the raw confusion etched across this man's features didn't look like an act. Still, she wasn't ready to trust him. "What about your name?" she asked again. "Any part of letter?" "A sound, anything." The man shook his head helplessly. "No." Ethan stirred in the recliner at the sound of their voices, blinking sleep from his eyes. "Morning," he mumbled, stretching his cramped limbs before standing up. He walked toward the couch, his expression earnest. "Are you feeling better?" The man managed a weak smile. "A little. Thanks to you." Ethan looked relieved but also curious. "Do you remember anything yet?" The man shook his head again, and Ethan's shoulders sagged. Helen stood up and poured the man a cup of coffee, handing it to him carefully. "Drink this. It might help clear your head." He accepted it gratefully, wrapping shaky hands around the warm mug. Ethan sat on the arm of the recliner, watching closely. Helen could tell by the intensity in his eyes that the boy was already attached to this stranger, already invested. That scared her. Ethan had lost so much already, his parents gone without explanation, their lives reduced to questions that never found answers. Helen didn't want another mystery to plant itself in the boy's heart. After a long moment of quiet thought, Helen spoke firmly. "All right, you can stay for today, just today. We'll try to figure out who you are, and then tomorrow we'll get you where you need to go." The man nodded slowly. "I understand." Ethan looked disappointed but didn't argue. Helen wasn't done though. "But until then," she added, her tone sharper, "I need you to be honest with me. If anything at all comes back to you, You tell me immediately. If someone out there is looking for you, I need to know whether they're coming to help or coming to cause trouble. The man looked genuinely shaken by her warning. I don't want to bring trouble into your home, he said quietly. You already have, Helen replied, her voice gentle but firm, but we'll figure it out. She stood and walked back to the kitchen. Ethan sat beside the stranger now, watching him sip the coffee. The man stared into the mug as though hoping to find answers at the bottom. He whispered, I wish I could remember who I am. Ethan rested a small hand on the man's arm. It's okay. Maybe your memory just needs time. Helen overheard and closed her eyes for a moment, hoping Ethan was right, but fearing what the truth might bring. Because deep down she sensed something. People didn't forget entire lives unless something awful had happened. And whatever that awful thing was, whatever had pushed this stranger into a rail yard. Bruised and lost, Helen had a sickening feeling it wasn't finished with him yet. And now it was at her doorstep. The next morning arrived colder than expected. The kind of crisp Detroit morning where the air bites at exposed skin and the streets feel almost frozen in time. Ethan woke before the sun fully rose, as he always did. But this time he wasn't thinking about scrap metal or the day's rote. His first thought was the man on the couch, this strange, battered figure whose presence had changed the rhythm of their home overnight. Ethan slipped on his worn jacket and stepped quietly into the living room. The man was awake, sitting carefully with his back against the cushions. Staring at the steam rising from a cup of coffee Helen must have brought him earlier. He looked both stronger and more fragile at the same time. Like someone who had walked through trouble but didn't yet understand the shape of it. When he noticed Ethan, he offered a small, tired smile. Morning, the man said softly, voice rough but more stable than the night before. Ethan nodded. Morning, does your head still hurt? The man touched the bruise near his temple, a bit. But I think I can stand on my own today. That wasn't entirely true. Ethan could see the slight tremor in his hands, the stiffness in his posture, but he appreciated the man's effort to look composed. Helen entered a moment later, tying her hair back as she stepped into the room. She looked better rested, but only slightly. Breakfast is ready, she said, but her eyes didn't move away from the stranger. You need to eat something before we figure out what to do with you today. The man nodded gratefully and attempted to stand. His legs wobbled, but he steadied himself against the couch. Ethan moved closer instinctively, ready to catch him if he slipped. The man managed to straighten, though he clearly needed the wall for balance. Helen noticed but didn't say anything. Pride was something she understood well. They ate quietly scrambled eggs, dry toast, and the last of the apples Helen had sliced thin to make them last longer. The stranger handled the fork clumsily at first, as if even the simple act of eating was a test of endurance. Ethan watched him closely, studying every movement, every expression, trying to guess what kind of life this man had come from before it all vanished from his mind. He didn't act like someone used to hardship. His manners were careful, refined even, and there was a sharpness in his eyes that suggested intelligence no injury could fully erase. Ethan could see why Helen remained cautious. People like this man didn't end up in neighborhoods like theirs without a reason, usually a dangerous one. After breakfast, the man insisted on helping with chores as a way to repay them. Even if he could barely lift more than a few pounds. Helen hesitated but eventually relented, assigning him simple tasks. She still didn't trust him completely, but she wasn't the type to refuse honest effort. Ethan took the man outside to the backyard where the small vegetable garden stretched across the patchy soil. The autumn season had already turned most of the plants brittle, but a few hardy vegetables clung stubbornly to life. Ethan knelt down to check the soil, gesturing toward the wilted tomato plants. They used to be bigger, he said. Grandma can't take care of them as much anymore, so I try. The man crouched beside him, moving slower but with genuine interest. You take care of all this? He asked. Ethan shrugged. Yeah, Grandma taught me how to grow things. Says the earth listens if you treat it right. The man smiled faintly. Sounds wise. She is, Ethan replied, glancing back toward the house where Helen was sweeping the porch. The man reached out and brushed some loose dirt between his fingers. I've never worked with a garden before. Ethan wasn't surprised. That's okay, it's not hard, you just have to be patient. The man's eyes softened as he watched the boy carefully recover the plant roots. I could learn, he said quietly, almost to himself. If you want to show me. Ethan brightened a little at the idea. He didn't have many chances to teach anything to adults. Sure. Just don't break anything, he teased. The man let out a weak laugh. I will try not to. They spent nearly an hour outside, with Ethan demonstrating how to trim dead leaves, how to water the fragile plants without overwhelming them, and how to check whether the soil was too dry or too dense. The man struggled at first, his movements slow and awkward, but he paid careful attention. It felt strange to him, kneeling in the dirt of a backyard garden, yet strangely grounding too. Every task Ethan had seemed to chip away at the fog surrounding his mind, giving him something tangible to hold on to. Helen watched the scene unfold from the porch, broom in hand. Part of her remained uneasy about letting the stranger get close to Ethan, but she couldn't ignore the sincerity in his effort. The man was really trying to be helpful, to earn their trust. She had seen people pretend before, but his clumsy attempts at gardening didn't look like pretense. They looked like someone desperately trying to belong somewhere, even temporarily. When they finished in the garden, Ethan led the man around the neighborhood to show him where he collected scrap metal. It wasn't exactly a tour anyone would dream of giving, but Ethan felt it was important. If the man was going to stay another day, he needed to understand the world Ethan lived in, one built on survival and resourcefulness. They passed vacant houses with boarded windows, graffiti, covered brick walls, and stray dogs wandering between alleys. Ethan explained which places were safe, which weren't, which neighbors to greet, and which to avoid. The man listened carefully, absorbing every detail as if mapping a completely foreign land. At one point they stopped beside an abandoned car rusting on the curb. Ethan pointed to the underside. "Sometimes people leave metal here," he said. "But you have to be careful. There can be broken glass." The man nodded. "You know a lot about this." Ethan shrugged again. "You learn fast when you have to." There was no bitterness in his voice, just truth. As they walked back toward the house, Ethan pushed his wagon while the man carried only a few small tools light enough for him to handle without losing balance. The man glanced at the boy beside him, taking in the determination etched across his young face. "You work very hard," he said quietly. Ethan looked up, surprised but proud. "Grandma needs her medicine, so I do what I can." The man's expression tightened slightly at that. "That's a lot for someone your age." Ethan didn't look away. "It's life." The man inhaled deeply, a mix of admiration and sorrow reflected in his eyes. He didn't know who he was yet, but he knew one thing for certain: he owed this boy far more than he could ever repay. By the time they returned to the house, Helen had finished sweeping and was peeling potatoes by the sink. She turned to see them enter, the boy with dirt smudged across his cheek. The stranger holding a pair of gardening shears with the awkward pride of someone who had completed a job for the first time. Helen assessed them both with a raised brow. "Well," she said, "looks like you two didn't destroy anything." Ethan grinned. "He's not bad at gardening." The man chuckled softly. "Beginner's luck, I suppose." Helen didn't smile, but Ethan could tell her guard had lowered one notch, just one. But that was something. As the afternoon faded, the man helped Ethan sort through the small pile of scrap metal collected earlier. Though he was still weak, he sorted carefully, listening to the boy's explanations about value and weight. It was tedious work, but the man didn't complain. Instead, he seemed grateful to have something to do, something that made him feel useful. It grounded him in a way nothing else had since waking up. By evening, after a day spent working together, the man realized something unexpected. He felt a sense of peace he couldn't explain. He still didn't know his name, his past, or why he had been left beaten behind a rail yard. But he knew this: helping Ethan, learning from him, earning Helen's cautious acceptance, these things gave him purpose while the empty space in his mind remained dark. And though he didn't want to burden them, he also didn't want to leave. Not yet. He didn't know it then, but this was the beginning of the bond that would reshape all their lives. Ethan had given him shelter, but more importantly, Ethan had given him a reason to try again. And for a man who had lost everything, that reason meant more than he could ever put into words. As the days passed, Ethan and the man, still nameless, still lost inside his own memory, slowly slipped into a routine that felt almost natural, even if none of them quite admitted it out loud. The man worked in the garden every morning beside Ethan, learning how to trim, water, and coax life out of stubborn Detroit soil. He was still weak, still unsteady at times, but his hands grew steadier with each passing day, and his focus sharpened. Helen watched from the window while washing dishes or sorting pills into her small collection of weekly organizers. She didn't smile openly, but sometimes her eyes softened, just for a moment before she forced them back to caution. Trust came slowly to her, slower than it came Ethan, but something about the man's sincerity chipped away at her guardedness bit by bit. One late afternoon, after a long morning of tending the backyard and an early scrap collecting trip with Ethan, the man and the boy were walking back home through a side alley when they spotted something out of place. 3 men, all wearing crisp suits far too expensive for this neighborhood, stood near the entrance to the old rail yard. They talked to a group of locals, showing a picture to each person before moving down the street. Ethan stopped immediately, his breath catching in his throat. The man beside him felt his blood run cold without fully understanding why. Something about the sight of those suits, the intensity in their posture, and the way their eyes scanned every corner told him instinctively that they weren't here for anything good. Don't let them see you, Ethan whispered urgently, tugging at the man's sleeve. For a moment, the man didn't move, unable to look away from the scene unfolding across the street. One of the suited men held a photo in his hand, and though the boy couldn't see it from this distance, the man felt a sudden, sinking certainty that the face on that photo was his. He stepped back instinctively, gripping the side of a rusted dumpster for support. His chest tightened. Whatever part of his memory had been locked behind fog was now stirring with a painful, electric awareness. Whoever he used to be, someone was looking for him, not with good intentions. "We have to go," Ethan insisted, pulling harder now. "Come on." The man followed him, still staring at the group of men as they questioned a couple of older neighbors, handing each one the same small photograph. The way the neighbors reacted, curious, nervous, some immediately shaking their heads, made it clear those men weren't from here. They were outsiders, professionals, people who brought tension with them wherever they stepped. When one of them briefly turned toward their direction, Ethan grabbed the man's arm and yanked him behind a fence, hiding them from view. "Don't let them see your face," Ethan said in a hushed tone. "People dressed like that don't come here unless they want something. And they don't ask this many questions unless it's serious." The man nodded, though fear made his throat tighten. A strange pressure built behind his temples, as if his mind was trying to force a broken memory back into place. He pressed a hand against his forehead and closed his eyes, breathing through the pain. Fragments flickered, shadows of a room, a raised voice, a flash of anger, then nothing but the overwhelming sense of danger. "I think they were looking for me," he whispered. Ethan tensed. "How do you know?" The man opened his eyes slowly. "I don't know how, I just know there was fear there, deep and real, not just confusion." Ethan swallowed hard and peeked through a crack in the fence. The men were moving down the street now, approaching the corner near the bus stop. "We need to get home," Ethan said. "My grandma will know what to do." The man forced himself to focus and followed Ethan down the narrow alley behind a row of small houses. They moved quickly but carefully, making sure to stay behind fences or trees whenever possible. The man's heart beat heavily, not just from the physical strain but from the rising dread he couldn't name. Every step felt heavier, as if he were walking toward something he wasn't ready to face. When they reached the house, Helen was outside sweeping the porch again, though she immediately paused when she saw their expressions. "What happened?" she asked, her voice sharp. Ethan barely waited for her to finish the question. "Grandma, there were men, 3 of them in suits. They were showing people a picture. I think they were looking for him." He pointed back at the man behind him. Helen stiffened. She didn't waste time. Inside, now they hurried into the house while Helen locked the door behind them. She clicked the deadbolt twice, then shut the blinds with quick, practiced movements. The man sat down heavily on the couch, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his chest. "I think they reconnected to whatever happened to me," he said quietly. "I don't know how, but it feels true." Helen turned to him, her expression serious and unreadable. "Describe them." "Suits," Ethan answered before the man could. "Fancy ones. Expensive." They had a photo and kept asking people. Helen nodded slowly as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "Men like that don't knock on doors looking for lost family," she said. "They come for business. And business like theirs doesn't involve compassion." The man rubbed his temples again, desperation growing. "Why would they be looking for me? Why don't I remember anything?" Helen watched him, her eyes softer now but still wary. "Because something bad happened to you," she said gently. "People don't lose their memory for no reason. And people with suits don't go searching for someone like you unless there's something big at stake." Ethan sat next to the man, worry etched across his young face. "Grandma, what do? We can't let them take him." Helen hesitated. She wasn't someone who got scared easily, but she knew enough about the world to recognize danger when it knocked. "For now," she said carefully, "we keep him inside. We stay quiet. We don't open the door unless we know who it is." The man leaned back, closing his eyes again as if trying to force clarity into the blank pages of his mind. "I feel like something terrible is waiting for me," he murmured. "Like the truth is ugly." Helen sat down across from him. "Maybe it is," she admitted, "but you rebreathing, you rehear. That means you have a chance to face it on your terms, not theirs." The house grew tense and still, the weight of uncertainty settling over them like dust. Ethan placed a small hand on the man's arm again, squeezing with quiet reassurance. "We'll figure it out," the boy said softly. "You don't have to remember everything right now. You're safe here." The man nodded but couldn't quite believe it, because deep inside, through the fog and fear, he sensed something. Those men weren't giving up. Whatever they wanted from him, they were getting closer. And sooner or later, the truth he feared would crash through the fragile calm of this small Detroit home. The man barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, flashes of color and broken shapes drifted through his mind like shadows of memories floating just out of reach. He heard muffled voices, the scrape of a chair, the slam of a door, and a feeling sharp, urgent, telling him he had been in danger long before he woke up in that rail yard. But when he tried to grasp the pieces, they evaporated, leaving him frustrated and exhausted. Ethan, on the other hand, slept on the recliner near the couch again, curled up under a thin blanket as if determined not to let the man out of his sight. Helen dozed on and off in her rocking chair, fully clothed, her mind clearly too alert to rest. That was how the household moved through the long hours, waiting for dawn to bring clarity that never seemed to come. When morning finally arrived, pale and cold, the man sat up slowly, careful not to wake Ethan. His head throbbed with a dull ache, but something else stirred beneath the pain, an instinct, a whisper in the back of his mind urging him to leave. Not because he didn't feel safe, but because he didn't want to bring trouble to Ethan and Helen. The memory fragments he kept seeing were disturbing enough that he feared what might happen once the men in suits got closer. Maybe he could slip away before they returned. Maybe he could protect the boy and his grandmother by disappearing again, even if it meant walking straight into uncertainty. But as soon as he stood up, Ethan woke with a jolt. "Where are you going?" Ethan asked, blinking sleep from his eyes. The man didn't answer right away. He had hoped to avoid this conversation. "I don't want to put you or your grandma in danger," he said finally. "Those men, I think they reconnected to something bad. Something about me." Ethan rubbed his eyes with the back of his hands. "So? That doesn't mean you should just leave. We don't even know who they are." The boy stood, planting himself between the man and the door as if his small frame could block any escape. "Grandma says running away never fixes anything." The man let out a tired breath. "Running away might be the only way to keep you safe." Ethan shook his head firmly. "You saved my grandma yesterday. If she didn't get her medicine, she might be ended up in the hospital again. You helped us. We're helping you." For a moment, the man didn't know what to say. Ethan's words hit him with a weight he didn't expect. He had been living in a fog since waking up, lost and fearful. But here was a boy who barely knew him standing firm with absolute conviction. Helen entered the room, her voice hoarse but steady. "The boy's right," she said. "You are not going anywhere until we understand what we're up against." She walked to the window and peeked through the blinds, scanning the street. "Besides," she continued, "those men will be back. You stepping outside now is the quickest way to walk right into them." The man felt a shiver roll through him. Helen wasn't someone who exaggerated. She said things only when she believed them completely. He sank back onto the couch, defeated but also strangely relieved. Something deep inside him told him Helen was right. Whatever he was running from wasn't the kind of danger you outran alone. As they sat around the small kitchen table drinking warm oatmeal and weak coffee, Ethan explained in detail everything he had seen the previous day. "They were asking about you," Ethan repeated. "I could tell. The way they looked around, the picture they had, they were searching hard." Helen asked questions, the kind that showed she'd spent her entire life scanning for trouble and learning its patterns. "Did they look like cops?" "No," Ethan said. The man agreed. "Something about them felt private, controlled, almost corporate." "Then they rehired," Helen concluded. "Someone with money wants you found. People like that don't knock on doors for charity." The man stared into his coffee, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily in his gut. Someone with money, someone with power. Someone willing to send men into one of the roughest neighborhoods in Detroit to find him. He didn't need a full memory to know that meant something serious. "Can we find out who I am?" the man asked suddenly. He wasn't sure what made him say it, but he felt the shift in the room the moment the question left his mouth. Ethan's head lifted, his eyes bright with possibility. Helen leaned back, her fingers tapping against the table. "We can try," she said at last. "But you need something, anything to help us start." The man glanced down at his wrist. The watch, polished, pristine despite everything, glinted under the kitchen light. He held it up. "This is the only thing that feels familiar," he said. "Maybe it means something." Helen took the watch carefully, turning it over. The engraved letters caught her eye. "DS with love, Amanda." She read the inscription out loud. Ethan's brows furrowed. "Maybe that's your name. Maybe Redias." The man tried the initials on his tongue, but nothing stirred in his mind. Not recognition, not clarity, but the engraving gave them something, a direction, a clue. "We can ask around," Helen said, wiping her hands on a towel. "Someone out there knows something. And sooner or later we'll have to go to someone who can help." But even she sounded uncertain. Ethan's face lit with excitement. "We could go to the library. They have computers. Maybe we can look up missing people with those initials." Helen paused, considering it. "Maybe," she said slowly. "But it's risky. If anyone is tracking him electronically, we might alert them the moment we start searching." Ethan swallowed. "So what do we do?" For a moment no one spoke. Then the man sat up straighter, a sudden confidence flickering, small but real. "What if we start with people, not computers?" he said. "Someone hired those men. Someone must be reported me missing." It was logical. Dangerous but logical. "We find the person who wants you found," Helen said, her voice steady yet unsure. "And we pray they re not the same person who put you in that rail yard." Ethan glanced toward the window as if expecting more men in suits to appear. "What if," he began hesitantly, "what if they re looking for you because they care about you?" Helen looked at him sadly. "People with money don't send men in suits to show photos door to door when they care," she said. "They go to the police." "This is different." The man's chest tightened again. He didn't know who he used to be, but he knew one thing now: whoever he had been, he lived in a world where trust was not given easily. And yet here he was in a tiny house in Detroit, being protected by people who had every reason not to trust strangers. People who had opened their home to him without asking anything in return. A warmth spread through him, something unfamiliar yet comforting. A feeling he couldn't name but held onto desperately. "Whatever my past is," he said quietly, looking between Helen and Ethan, "I'm grateful I woke up here." Helen looked away, pretending to fix the dish towel on the counter, but Ethan saw the small smile she tried to hide. The man didn't know it, but this was the moment when his survival stopped being just luck. It became something else, a fragile, unexpected bond tying his fate to the boy and the grandmother who had taken him in. Little did he know, the truth about who he was would soon come crashing into their lives, bringing with it danger, betrayal, and the key to the memory he so desperately needed. But for now, all he had were two people who cared, and that was enough to keep him fighting. Helen had always been the type of woman who could stretch $1 farther than anyone else on the block, but even she couldn't escape the rising cost of medicine. By the end of that week, Ethan noticed the familiar tightness in her breaths whenever she stood too fast or climbed the few short steps to the porch. She brushed it off every time, claiming she was just tired, but he knew the signs too well. He had watched her health dip slowly for years, like a candle burning lower with no one around to replace it. She still tried to hide it, tried to keep her strength around him and the man they were sheltering. But Ethan could read her face better than anyone. He knew when she was hiding pain, and today she was doing a poor job of pretending. It happened late in the afternoon. The three of them had just finished reorganizing the small shed where Ethan stored tools and scrap metal. Helen had joined them outside, insisting she needed fresh air, but halfway through the task she grew pale, clutching the edge of the shed wall with a trembling hand. Ethan saw it immediately. "Grandma?" he asked, worry creeping into his voice. Helen attempted a reassuring smile, though her lips barely lifted. "Just a little dizzy," she murmured. But the man, still nameless, still piecing together fragments of his past, noticed the way her knees wobbled, and the way she struggled to steady her breaths. He stepped closer. "You should sit down," he said gently, but Helen shook her head, ever stubborn. "I'll be fine. I need to finish this." Before she could take another step, her legs buckled. She reached for the shed wall but missed, and her body swayed dangerously. Ethan lunged toward her, but he was too small to stop her fall. The man reacted faster, grabbing her under the arms before she hit the dirt. He lowered her gently to the ground while Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, panic written across his young face. "Grandma! Are you okay?" Helen tried to answer, but her words tangled into a weak, breathless mumble. Her eyelids fluttered. She looked fragile, too fragile for Ethan to process without feeling something inside him crack. The man examined her quickly, instincts sharpening despite his still muddled memory. "Her pulse is fast," he said, "erratic." Ethan swallowed hard. "It's her condition. She needs her medicine." The man held Helen's hand and glanced at Ethan. "Do you have enough?" Ethan shook his head. "We re-out. Her refill wasn't ready because we couldn't afford it yet. I was supposed to get more scrap tomorrow to help pay for it." The man's heart dropped. He couldn't remember his own name, couldn't remember his past, but standing there holding Helen's trembling hand, he didn't hesitate for a second. "We don't have until tomorrow," he said firmly. "She needs help now." Ethan looked at him desperately. "But we can't afford the emergency visit. We can't even afford the medication without saving for days." The man rose to his feet, determination sharpening his features. "There's something I can sell." Ethan blinked up at him, confused. "Sell? What?" The man held up his wrist. The watch glinted in the fading sunlight, pristine and elegant, its polished surface a stark contrast to everything around them. "This," he said. "It's worth something, probably a lot, enough for whatever she needs." Ethan's eyes widened. "But it's all you have left. It might tell you who you are." The man kneeled in front of the boy so they were eye level. "It's a thing," he said quietly. "Your grandma is a life. I won't stand here and let her suffer because I'm clinging to something made of metal." The conviction in his tone left no room for argument. For Ethan, the watch had become a symbol of the man's mysterious identity, a clue to a world he had lost. But for the man, Hillen's life mattered more than any clue, more than any past. He helped Ethan bring Hillen inside and place her carefully on the couch, covering her with a blanket while she drifted in and out of consciousness. Her breathing remained shallow, and every soft gasp made Ethan's throat tighten. The man placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I'll be back as fast as I can. Stay with her. Keep her awake if possible." Ethan nodded but couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. "Please hurry," he whispered. "I will," the man promised. He grabbed an old jacket from the coat rack and slipped the watch off his wrist. For a moment he stared at it, feeling the weight of it not just in his hand, but in what it represented. Whoever he had been, someone had once given him this with love. Someone had engraved their affection into its metal. It was a reminder of a life he had lost, of relationships he no longer remembered. But right now it was just a tool, a way to save the only family he knew. He rushed out the door and jogged down the street toward the busier section of the neighborhood. His steps were unsteady at first, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He kept his head down, avoiding the eyes of strangers, hoping none of the men in suits were still anywhere nearby. He found a small pawn shop near the corner of an aging strip mall. The windows were dusty, the neon sign flickering weakly. He pushed the door open, setting off a bell that jingled through the cramped space cluttered with old guitars, watches, electronics, and forgotten memorabilia. Behind the counter stood a man with thick glasses and a skeptical expression. The kind of pawn shop owner who had seen every trick in the book. He didn't smile when the stranger entered. He simply looked him up and down with cautious curiosity. "Help you?" he asked. The man approached slowly and placed the watch on the counter. "I need to sell this," he said. The pawn shop owner raised an eyebrow. "You reselling that? You sure you know what you were doing?" The man nodded firmly. "How much can you give me?" The owner examined the watch through a magnifying lens, turning it over in his hands. His eyes widened slightly at the engraving and craftsmanship, but he hid his reaction quickly. "This is real," he said. "Expensive. You could get a lot for this at the right place." The man leaned closer. "I'm not looking for the right place. I'm looking for right now." The owner studied him for a long moment. "All right," he said finally. "I will give you enough to cover whatever emergency you are dealing with." The man didn't question how the owner knew. Desperation had a way of showing itself clearly. Within minutes, he had enough cash in his hands to buy Helen's medication and cover a clinic visit if needed. He thanked the owner and sprinted to the nearest pharmacy, breath burning in his lungs but his determination overriding the pain. He paid for the medicine, clutched the bag, and hurried back through the cold evening air. By the time he returned to the house, Ethan was sitting beside Helen, holding her hand and trying to keep her awake. When the boy saw the medicine bag, relief washed over his face like sunlight breaking through clouds. "You got it," Ethan breathed. Of course, the man replied, kneeling beside Helen. "She's going to be okay." He helped her sit up, coaxed her to take the pills, and waited as she slowly regained color in her cheeks. Her breathing steadied. Her eyelids lifted. She looked at the man, confused but grateful. "You sold your watch," she whispered. "You shouldn't have." He shook his head. "I did what had to be done." For the first time since he had arrived in their lives, Helen reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you," she said, voice raspy but sincere. Ethan looked between them, heart swelling with gratitude and admiration. The man had given up the only link to his past just to save someone he barely knew. And in that moment, a bond formed, unspoken but powerful, binding the three of them closer than ever before. He had come into their home with nothing but confusion and fear. Now he had something more valuable than memory. He had purpose, he had family. And though he didn't know it yet, the price he paid at that pawn shop would become the first domino in a chain of events leading straight back to the life he'd lost and the danger that was still hunting him. The night after Helen's condition finally stabilized was quiet in a way that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Ethan slept sitting up again, his head resting against the arm of the couch where his grandmother lay bundled in blankets. The man, still without a name, watched over them from the chair nearby, his exhaustion pushing against him like a tide, yet his mind refusing to rest. Every time he shut his eyes, the memory of selling the watch replayed in his mind, the engraving, the shine, the sense of loss. It was the last piece of a life he couldn't remember, and now it was gone. He didn't regret it, not for a moment, but the act had shaken something loose inside him. He felt it as a pressure behind his temples at first, then a flicker of recognition so faint he almost dismissed it. But it grew stronger with every hour. It was like a door inside his mind was unlocking one hinge at a time. Random images surfaced in short bursts: a vast glass office, a conference table filled with documents, tall buildings stretching beyond a window, a boardroom with unfamiliar faces staring at him, a man with a cold expression speaking sharply, and a woman her voice raised in anger, her hand gripping his arm as if trying to prevent him from walking away. He saw flashes of luxury polished shoes stepping across marble floors, the reflection of city lights in a sleek car window, a private elevator rising through the floors of a skyscraper. Then came another image so clear, so vivid it stole his breath. A signature, his hand holding a pen, a contract with the name Daniel Scott printed at the bottom. The force of the memory hit him like a wave. He inhaled sharply and gripped the arms of the chair. Daniel Scott, Daniel Scott. The name echoed in his mind, echoing with familiarity that rose and expanded like a blooming flame. He whispered it to himself slowly, almost afraid it might slip away again. Daniel, the word tasted right in his mouth. It felt like his name, like a missing piece clicking into place. Moments later, Ethan stirred, blinking up at him with sleepy eyes. "UK," the boy murmured. The man looked at him with something new in his expression, a mixture of fear, recognition, and awakening. "Ethan," he whispered. "I remember something." The boy straightened instantly, every trace of sleep disappearing. What did you remember?" The man rubbed his forehead, trying to steady his breathing. "My name," he said. I think my name is Daniel." Ethan's jaw dropped. For the first time since the man had arrived in their lives, he wasn't just a stranger anymore. He had a name, a real name. "Daniel," Ethan repeated, testing it the same way the man had. "That sounds right." Helen's eyes opened slowly, pulled awake by the sound of their voices. Even weak, she could sense the shift in the room, the tension humming in the air. "What's going on?" she whispered. Ethan turned to her eagerly. "Grandma." He remembered something. He remembered his name. "It's Daniel!" Helen blinked at the man. No. At Daniel, studying him the way she had studied every danger and every miracle that had crossed her path for decades. "Daniel," she repeated thoughtfully. "Does it feel true to you?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, it feels like something real, something solid." Helen's gaze sharpened. "Did you remember anything else?" Daniel hesitated. The images had been fragmented, flashes rather than full scenes, but enough to give him hints about the life he had come from. "I saw a building," he said, "a big one. Offices, glass windows, contracts, a boardroom." I think he paused, the weight of realization settling over him. "I think I was someone important." Ethan's eyes widened with admiration. Like a boss, Daniel let out a weak, humorless laugh. "Maybe something like that." Helen, however, wasn't smiling. Her mind was already working through the implications. A man with expensive suits, a watch worth thousands. Men in suits searching for him, a corporate boardroom, contracts. This wasn't a simple case of someone who had been mugged or run away from home. This was the kind of man powerful people kept track of, the kind whose disappearance could shake more than one life. Before she could respond, another memory slammed into Daniel with brutal force. At a heated argument in a dark office, voices rising, accusations scattered like shattered glass. The cold face of a man, stern, menacing, leaning forward across his desk, a woman shouting his name, a hand clamping around his arm. A glass of amber liquid, a strange taste. The sensation of falling, then nothing. Daniel gasped loudly, gripping his chest as the memory hit him so hard he nearly slid off the chair. Ethan scrambled forward. "Daniel, what happened? What did you see?" Daniel couldn't speak for a moment. He pressed his palms into his eyes, trying to ease the stabbing sensation behind them. "Someone hurt me," he whispered. "I was arguing with someone, a man and a woman. Something happened, something bad." Helen's face turned grave. "Do you remember their faces?" Daniel shook his head. "No, just anger, threats, and a drink." Helen stiffened instantly. She had lived long enough to know what that meant. "You were drugged," she said quietly. The room seemed to contract around them. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Drugged? Why?" Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. "I don't know, but I remember falling. After that, nothing." Helen said slowly, as if bracing herself. "Daniel, whoever did that to you didn't do it by accident. They wanted you gone." Daniel looked at her, fear creeping into his eyes. "But why would anyone want to get rid of me?" Helen didn't soften her words. "Because you were someone important," she repeated. "Important enough for someone to see you as a threat." Daniel stared at the floor, his pulse quickening. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, dark, dangerous, and bigger than anything he or the Millers were prepared for. But the most terrifying realization wasn't remembering the danger. It was realizing he wasn't done with it. Ethan touched his arm, voice trembling slightly. "Daniel, do you think those men in suits are the same people who did this to you?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The dread in his eyes said enough. Helen straightened herself, though her body was still weak. "If they drugged you, if they wanted you out of the way, then those men aren't here to help you," she said. "They're here to finish what someone else started." The room fell into a heavy stillness as the truth settled over them like a storm cloud. Daniel finally had a name, but that name came with danger. Someone out there wanted Daniel Scott erased. And now that his memory was returning, they would be back. Not with questions, not with photographs, but with intention. Deadly intention. And the Miller family was now caught in the middle of something far larger than they ever imagined. Daniel didn't sleep after the memories hit him. Knowing his name changed something inside him, gave him a sense of identity, but it also opened the door to terror he didn't fully understand. Now he knew he hadn't just wandered into trouble. He had been put into it, dropped into a place where no one would expect to find a man like him. Someone wanted him gone. Someone had drugged him and dumped him like trash. And the fact that he was alive meant that person's plan wasn't finished. Morning light crept over the neighborhood, casting soft hues across the peeling paint of the Miller house. Helen tried to stand and make breakfast, but Daniel gently guided her back to the couch. "You need to rest," he said. She glared at him for a brief second before finally giving in. Ethan hovered near the kitchen doorway, anxiety radiating from him in waves. "What do we do now?" the boy asked. "You remembered who you are. That means whoever hurt you might know you re-alive." Daniel didn't respond at first. He looked out the window, scanning the street as if expecting black cars to appear at any moment. "I need to go back," he said finally. "Back where?" Ethan asked, perplexed. Daniel rubbed his jaw. "Where I lived, where I worked. Wherever my life was." Helen's voice sharpened. "Absolutely not. You saw what happened when you tried to just exist outside. You walked into a rail yard half dead. You think walking back to your old world is smart." Daniel sighed heavily. "If I don't go back, the people who hurt me will come here. They're already searching." Helen held his gaze with steely determination. "And if you walk into their hands alone, you won't come back. They didn't finish you the first time, but they will next time." Ethan stepped forward, fists clenched at his sides. "You can't go by yourself. We won't let you." Daniel looked between them, seeing the fear in the boy's eyes and the fierce protectiveness in Helen's. They weren't just worried for him, they were worried about what would happen to themselves as if he left. Helen wasn't physically capable of dealing with danger, and Ethan was only a child. Daniel couldn't let harm come to them because of his past. He paced the small living room, fingers running through his hair. "I need answers," he muttered. "I need to know who did this to me and why." Helen slowly pushed herself to sit upright. "Then you need help," she said. "And not the wrong kind. You need someone who knows you. Someone you trusted before this happened." Daniel considered that. A few more flickers of memory broke through board meetings, business deals, handshakes, stern discussions. Faces appeared, but they were blurry. Most were unfamiliar. But one stood out, a man beside him in an office, handing him documents with a reassuring smile. A man he trusted. Or thought he trusted. "Richard," he whispered suddenly. Ethan perked up. "Richard, who's that?" Denial stared at the floor. "I think he was my business partner, someone close to me." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Can you trust him?" Daniel hesitated. In his memory, Richard had worn a friendly expression. But he also remembered a flash from last night's nightmare, a cold gaze from the same face. He shook his head. "I don't know." Helen leaned forward, her voice calm but unwavering. "Then he's not the one you contact first." Daniel sank into the nearest chair. "Then who do I reach out to? I don't remember anyone else." Ethan thought for a moment, then brightened slightly. "What about the woman? The one in your memory, the one who yelled your name? Maybe she cared about you." Daniel shut his eyes as her image surfaced again, long hair, elegant posture, anger and concern mixing in her expression. He didn't know if she loved him or hated him. "I don't know who she was," he admitted. "Amanda," he said after a moment, the name appearing from the fog. "That's the name engraved on my watch." Helen frowned. "The one you sold?" Daniel nodded. A lump formed in his throat at the reminder. "Yes." "Do you think she's part of what happened to you?" Helen asked. Daniel forced himself to think through the haze of fragmented memory. "I don't know," he repeated quietly. "But she was there." Helen put a hand on her forehead. "This just keeps getting messier." Ethan suddenly looked troubled, brows knitting together. "Daniel, is it possible that the people who hurt you are the same people who were supposed to care about you?" Daniel didn't want to answer. Not because he didn't know, but because a terrifying part of him suspected exactly that. Rich people didn't fight like poor people. Rich people fought with power, lawyers, business takeovers, hidden threats, and quiet removal of obstacles. And if Daniel had been someone powerful, someone valuable, then removing him wouldn't happen with fists or street violence. It would happen exactly how his memory showed, behind closed doors, with poisoned drinks and whispered decisions. "I think," Daniel said slowly, "that someone close to me betrayed me, and I don't know who." Helen exhaled sharply. "Then you're not going where near your old life until we figure this out." Daniel shook his head. "I can't hide here forever. You were both in danger because of me." Ethan stepped closer, expression fierce. "We were not letting you go alone. If we re-in this, we re-in it together." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, gratitude or guilt, he couldn't tell. But before he could respond, a sound outside caught all three of their attention: car doors slamming. Daniel went to the window, carefully lifting the edge of the curtain. A black sedan he didn't recognize had parked across the street. Three men stepped out. They wore suits, expensive ones, just like the men who had been in the neighborhood days earlier. Helen stood immediately, despite her weakness. "Daniel," she whispered, voice trembling with urgency, "get away from the window." He obeyed instantly. Ethan's heartbeat thundered through the room. "They found us." Helen grabbed Daniel's arm. "You want to know who you are?" "Fine," she said. "But you don't go outside until we know if these people want to save you or bury you." Daniel swallowed hard. The weight of the moment crashed down on him like a wave. These men weren't here to help. He felt it deep in his bones. And suddenly he knew with absolute certainty. Whoever he had been in his old life, power and wealth had put a target on his back. And now that target was moving. Closer. Right to the Miller family's front door. Daniel Scott had finally gotten his name back. But the people who wanted him gone were not finished. Not by a long shot. And the next move in this dangerous game would decide all their fates. The black sedan remained parked across the street far too long for it to be anything innocent. Daniel, Helen, and Ethan stayed away from the windows, each of them breathing carefully, listening to the occasional car passing on the main road and the distant sound of a barking dog. Minutes dragged by, thick with tension. When the men finally moved, they didn't knock on doors or wave photographs like the previous group. Instead, they stood by the car, scanning the street with deliberate attention. One of them pointed toward the row of houses, and another spoke into a small device clipped to his collar. They weren't searching. They were waiting, and that was infinitely worse. Inside the house, Daniel felt the air tightening around his lungs. "This has to stop," he muttered. "I can't keep hiding in your living room while people like that close in." Helen shot him a sharp look. "You think going to them will fix it? They're not here to talk. They're here 'cause someone believes you're still alive." Ethan stepped closer, whispering urgently. "They're getting closer every time they come back. They know you didn't disappear. They must know you survived." Daniel ran his hand through his hair, pacing slowly around the small living room, the creaking floorboards tracking his anxiety. "Then I need to confront whoever betrayed me. I need to take back control of my life. I can't keep depending on you both." Helen raised a hand. "No one here said you have to depend forever. But walking into danger without knowing who wants you gone is not bravery. Suicide." Daniel paused, staring at her. The blunt truth in her voice sliced through the haze of fear in his chest. Ethan tugged on Daniel's sleeve. "What if we find someone else from your life? Someone who isn't trying to, hurt you?" Daniel wanted to argue, but the question sparked something inside him. A memory flickered. An older woman, maybe mid-50s, her smile gentle, handing him a folder during a meeting. Perhaps she was an assistant, someone he trusted enough to let into his inner circle. Then another image flashed: a young man in a navy suit helping him prepare for a speech, handing him a glass of water, patting him on the shoulder after he finished. These memories weren't complete, but they carried warmth rather than threat. There were people, Daniel said slowly. People who weren't part of the betrayal. Helen nodded. "Then those are the people we need to find." Before they could plan further, a new sound cut through the room: a knock. A single, dangerous knock at the front door. All three froze. Ethan grabbed Daniel's arm instinctively. Helen pressed a finger to her lips, her eyes sharp and alert. The knock came again, louder this time. Daniel's heartbeat thudded like a drum inside his chest. Helen motioned for them to move to the hallway, away from the door's immediate view. They obeyed silently. Someone outside called out, "Mr. Scott." The voice was muffled but clear enough to send ice through Daniel's veins. The man at the door knew his name. Helen's breath caught. Ethan's eyes widened. Daniel pressed his back against the wall, shaking his head vigorously. He whispered, "Don't answer it." Helen whispered back, "I wasn't planning on it." The knocking continued, but the voice grew calmer. "Metter. Scott, we were here to assist you. We were sent to find you and bring you home safely." Daniel recognized the tone: professional, rehearsed, empty. He'd heard voices like that in his fragmented memories, voices used to manipulating, persuading, pacifying. He didn't trust it for a second. Helen gathered her resolve and called through the door without opening it. "You have the wrong house." Her voice was steady and strong. The man outside paused for a few seconds before saying, "We know he is inside. We don't want to force anything." Ethan's breath hitched. Daniel felt an almost primal urge to protect them. "We need to get out," he whispered urgently, "through the back." Helen looked at him, fear visible beneath her stern exterior. "If we leave," she whispered, "they'll follow." Daniel shook his head. "Not if we move fast and don't go where they expect." They gathered quickly. Helen grabbed her purse and a small bag with her medication. Ethan grabbed his jacket and a flashlight. Daniel helped guide Helen toward the back door, careful not to make noise on the creaky floorboards. Outside, the backyard was quiet and dark. The autumn wind rustled the dying leaves, and the faint hum of distant traffic filled the air. Daniel led them behind the tall wooden fence. Sticking close to the shadows, Ethan whispered, "Where are we going?" Daniel scanned the alley behind the houses, searching for anything that could give them cover. "We need someplace public," he murmured. "Somewhere they can't grab us without witnesses." Helen frowned. "Like where?" Daniel hesitated. The flashes of memory had given him glimpses of downtown Detroit. Busy streets, people hustling, a place where powerful men didn't dare openly commit crimes. "Downtown," he said. "We'll figure out the rest from there." They moved down the alley at a brisk but quiet pace, the cold air burning their lungs. Helen's steps grew slower, her breathing strained. Daniel looped her arm over his shoulder, supporting her weight. Ethan walked ahead, peering around every corner to make sure they weren't being followed. The further they got from the house, the more Daniel's guilt grew. "I'm dragging you into this," he murmured. Helen squeezed his arm. "You didn't choose this," she said, "and we're not abandoning you." Those words stung Daniel in a way he didn't expect. He didn't deserve their loyalty. He didn't even know what he had done in his past life. But they were here, risking everything for him anyway. They reached the main road where the bus stop sat lonely under a flickering streetlight. Daniel checked both directions twice, searching for black sedans or men in suits. None yet. But that didn't mean they weren't close. When the bus finally arrived, the three boarded quickly and sat near the back. Daniel kept his head down, avoiding the security cameras. Helen watched out the window, her breath slow and steady but her eyes sharp with caution. Ethan leaned closer to Daniel. "Do you think those men will follow us?" Daniel answered truthfully. "Yes." Ethan swallowed. "Then we need to find someone from your old life fast." Daniel agreed silently. At this point he needed an ally, someone he trusted before, someone who wasn't part of the betrayal. The vision of the woman with the gentle smile resurfaced. She had handed him a folder with the name Scotech Construction printed at the top. That meant she had been close to his work. She might still be there. She might know what happened. And she might not want him dead. As the bus pulled away from the neighborhood, Daniel looked out the window at the dark streets fading behind them. He had no idea what awaited him downtown. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He was done running without a plan. He was done being prey. And he would uncover the truth who tried to erase him, and why before the people hunting him erased much more than his memory. The bus rattled through the uneven Detroit streets, carrying the three of them farther from the quiet neighborhood they had once felt safe in. Daniel kept his head low, eyes flicking from window reflections to passengers boarding at each stop. Every new face made tension pulse through his body. He felt exposed even in the dim interior of the bus, as if the men searching for him could appear at any moment. Helen sat stiffly beside him, clutching her small purse with shaking hands. Her strength, always bigger than her size, was still recovering from the medical scare the day before. Ethan squeezed her hand occasionally, trying to reassure her even though he was fighting his own fear. None of them spoke for a long stretch, each caught in their own thoughts as the cityscape shifted from cracked sidewalks and old houses to taller buildings and crowded intersections. When the bus finally rolled into the edge of downtown, Daniel felt something spark inside his fogged mind, familiarity mixed with dread. Glass towers rose into the gray sky, reflecting the streets below in distorted fragments. Somewhere among these buildings was the life he had lost, the life someone had tried to tear him away from. And if his memories were accurate, the deeper he went into this part of the city, the closer he was getting to the truth and the danger that came with it. Ethan peered out the window. "Where do we go now?" Daniel inhaled slowly, letting the flashes from his returning memory guide him. "There's an office tower," he said, "a big one. On Jefferson Avenue. I remember the lobby. I remember the people moving through it. I think it was my company." Helen studied him. "Are you sure?" Daniel shook his head. "No. But it's the only lead we have." Helen exhaled. "Then we move fast and stay alert." They stepped off the bus, the cold wind instantly hitting their faces. Downtown Detroit felt alive compared to their neighborhood horns, chatter, footsteps echoing between buildings, people rushing in all directions. It was the kind of place where three strangers blending into the crowd would normally go unnoticed. But Daniel wasn't naive enough to believe they were safe. If powerful people were looking for him, they would search the areas tied to his past. And his past was right here. They walked several blocks until they reached a tall building with a sleek facade of mirrored windows. Even before Daniel read the letters affixed near the entrance, Scotech Development Group, his pulse spiked in recognition. The name hit him with a force like a blow. His name, his company, his world. He froze on the sidewalk, feeling a sudden rush of images flood his mind. Meetings, blueprints, investors, skyscraper projects. his signature on contracts, his voice echoing through this very lobby. Ethan looked up at him. Daniel, this is it, isn't it? Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, I think this is where I worked. Helen stepped closer, lowering her voice. Then we don't go in blind, not without knowing who in there is friend or enemy. Daniel agreed, though the urge to storm inside and demand answers taunted him heavily. Instead, they moved to the side of the entrance, partially hidden by a column. Daniel scanned the faces of people entering the building, searching for anyone he might recognize. A few faces sparked vague familiarity, but nothing solid. He couldn't trust the fragments of memory enough to approach anyone. After several minutes, a woman walked out of the building, a woman whose face hit him with a jolt of vivid memory. Sharp eyes, auburn hair pulled back neatly, wearing a tailored blazer. In Daniel's mind, she appeared holding a stack of folders, smiling softly as she placed one on his desk. Linda Patterson, his executive assistant. Loyal, efficient, trusted. More importantly, someone who had never raised her voice in those broken memories, someone whose face carried no hostility. Ethan noticed Daniel's breath hitch. You remember her? Daniel nodded. Yes, she worked for me. She never seemed like someone who would want me hurt. Helen placed a steadying hand on his arm. Then she's our way in, but be careful. Daniel took a deep breath. I will. He stepped away from the column, adjusting his posture to appear more confident even though his legs felt unsteady. As he approached her, he saw her glance up briefly and freeze. Her eyes widened, her face draining of color. She whispered his name before she could stop herself. Daniel. He stopped a few feet away, heart pounding. Linda. She stared at him, stunned. Oh my God, they said you were dead. Helen and Ethan exchanged alarmed looks as those words cut the air sharply. Daniel felt something cold crawl up his spine. Who said that? He asked. Linda glanced around nervously, as if expecting someone to be listening. Not here, she whispered. They'll see you. They'll know. Daniel stepped closer. Please, I lost my memory. I need answers. Linda looked at him with a mix of shock, fear, and relief. Come with me, she said quickly. We have to get out of sight. She led them to a small cafe around the corner, choosing a table tucked far in the back. The moment they sat down, she leaned forward, her voice trembling. Daniel, you disappeared 3 weeks ago. The company announced you were presumed dead. Richard took over your position the next day. Daniel felt the floor shift beneath him. Richard, he repeated, the name tasting different now. Dangerous. Linda, he asked, did Richard know what happened to me? She hesitated. Fear flickered in her eyes. Daniel, you were planning to remove him from the board. You told me he was embezzling money from one of the subsidiary accounts. You said you had proof. Daniel's pulse thundered. The memory fragments sharpened, the argument, the cold expression, the betrayal. And Amanda, he asked. Linda's face softened. She tried to stop you from confronting him alone. She begged you to wait until you had legal backing. But you wouldn't. You stormed into Richard's private office that night. Daniel swallowed hard, and then Linda's voice grew hushed. You never came out. Ethan's eyes widened. Helen covered her mouth. Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes as the truth slammed into him. Richard had planned everything. The drink, the fall, the disappearance. And the men searching for him weren't there to rescue him. They were working for the man who believed Daniel's body would never be found. Linda looked at him with tears in her eyes. Daniel, if Richard finds out you're alive, he won't let you stay that way. Daniel opened his eyes, slowly meeting Helen's gaze, then Ethan's. The fear in their faces fueled something in him, something sharp, determined, burning. Then he'll find out the hard way, Daniel said. Because I'm taking my life back. And for the first time since waking in that rail yard, his fear was replaced with fire. His identity was no longer lost. His purpose no longer hidden. Richard had tried to erase him, but Daniel Scott wasn't done, not by a long shot. Daniel felt his entire world shift as Linda revealed the truth that Richard had not only taken over Scotech but had publicly declared him dead. Dead, the word echoed in his skull, heavy and bitter, like a verdict passed without trial. He tried to imagine what the press conference must have looked like. Richard standing confidently behind a podium, expressing fake grief, announcing tragic loss, all while ensuring investors remained calm as he seized power. It made Daniel's stomach twist. Ethan sat forward, eyes wide with disbelief. He really told everyone you were dead? Daniel nodded slowly, trying to stay grounded. Yes, and if Linda is right, that means he intended me to be dead. Helen's jaw tightened. Then going back to your company is walking into a trap. You need proof. You need allies. Daniel turned to Linda. Do you know who else I can trust? She hesitated, glancing around the cafe. Her voice was low when she answered. There's only one person I'm certain didn't want you harmed, your daughter. The world seemed to stop. Daniel stared at Linda, his mind reeled. My daughter, he repeated, unable to process the word. Linda's eyes softened with sympathy. Yes, her name is Danielle. She's 14. She lives with her mother. The memory hit him hard, so suddenly he grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. A girl laughing as she practiced a school presentation in their living room. A teenage voice complaining about too much homework. A smiling face leaning against his shoulder as they watched fireworks from the balcony. His daughter, his baby girl. The realization tore into him with equal parts love and anguish. Why didn't I remember her? He whispered. Linda shook her head gently. Traumatic memory loss isn't logical, Daniel. It chooses what to block. But she loves you. She's been devastated since you disappeared. Helen placed her hand on Daniel's forearm. Then she's your anchor. She might be the key to pulling you back into your old life. Ethan nodded excitedly. Yeah. If she knows her dad is alive, she'll help you. Daniel felt the first spark of hope since waking up in that rail yard. But the hope was fragile. Where is she? He asked. Where's Daniel? Linda hesitated. With Amanda. Daniel exhaled sharply. Another memory flickered. Amanda's voice raised, eyes angry, her hand grabbing his arm, begging him to slow down. Linda continued. Amanda hasn't been herself since your disappearance. She's been fighting Richard behind the scenes, but she's outnumbered. Daniel's breath quickened. Is she safe? Linda paused for now. But if Richard learns she's been pushing back, I don't know. Daniel stood abruptly, chair scraping across the floor. I have to see my daughter. She needs to know I'm alive. Helen reached for him. Daniel, think if Richard knows you're alive, he'll be expecting you to go to your family. Ethan added, yeah, he'll watch your house, right? Daniel pressed his hands over his face. They were right. Going straight to his daughter would put her at risk. He needed a plan. Linda, he asked, does Richard have people watching Amanda's house? Linda nodded grimly. Yes, he claims it's for their protection, but we all know better. He wants control. He feared Amanda and Daniel knew too much about your plans to remove him from the company. Daniel gritted his teeth. So Richard had taken his company, tried to take his life, and was now trying to control the people Daniel loved most. Rage simmered steady and sharp. Where can I meet her without being seen? Daniel asked. Linda thought hard. There's an art center uptown where Daniel goes for weekend painting classes. Amanda drops her off and picks her up. It's usually crowded, lots of students and families. If you wait near the back lot, you might catch her alone before or after class. Daniel nodded. When's her next class? Today, Linda said. In 2 hours. Ethan's face lit up with urgency. Then we need to get moving. Helen frowned. Careful. Those men might still be tracking us. Daniel turned to Linda. Can you get us there safely? She nodded. My car is parked 2 blocks over. We can take a route they won't expect. They left the cafe through the rear exit, moving quickly through the alley. Linda guided them through a maze of side streets, never staying exposed long enough for anyone to track their path. When they reached her silver sedan, she unlocked the doors and gestured for them to get in. Daniel helped Helen into the back seat before climbing in with her. Ethan took the passenger seat beside Linda. As the engine hummed to life, Daniel watched the city blur past, adrenaline coursing through him. For the first time since waking up, he wasn't running blindly. He had direction, he had purpose. He had a daughter waiting for him, even if she didn't know it yet. The drive was tense. Linda took alternate routes, making unexpected turns to shake any possible tail. Daniel found himself scanning every mirror, every car behind them, expecting to see a black sedan or unfamiliar men in suits. But none appeared. After nearly an hour weaving through various neighborhoods, the art center finally came into view, a remodeled brick building with colorful murals on the side walls. Families came and went, children carrying canvas paint supplies and backpacks. It was a place full of normalcy, creativity, and life. A stark contrast to the darkness that had consumed Daniel's world. Linda parked at the far end of the back lot, hidden behind a small row of trees. Daniel should be out in 15 minutes, she said. Daniel stared at the entrance, nerves overtaking him. What would she say? Would she recognize him? Would she believe he had lost his memory? Would she be scared, angry, hurt? His hands trembled as he imagined her face. Helen squeezed his shoulder. Take slow breaths, she said quietly. She's your daughter. The connection will come back. Ethan nodded. She'll be happy to see you. You re her dad. Minutes stretched painfully. Finally, the side door opened, and kids began spilling out, chatting, laughing, waving their paint-stained hands. Then he saw her, a teenage girl with wavy brown hair carrying a sketch pad under her arm. Her expression was thoughtful, distant. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who lived in 2 worlds, one artistic, one painful. Daniel felt his heart tighten. That was her. Daniel, his daughter. He stepped out of the car slowly, afraid any sudden movement might break the moment. Daniel walked farther into the lot, looking at her phone, unaware. Daniel whispered her name, his voice cracking. Daniel, she froze. Her head lifted. She scanned the lot. She saw him. He expected confusion, but instead her eyes widened with recognition so fast it struck him breathless. She whispered one word, trembling, Dad. Daniel nodded, tears threatening to spill. It's me. For a moment she didn't move. Then she dropped her sketch pad and ran. Daniel met her halfway, pulling her into his arms as she collapsed against him, sobbing uncontrollably. He held her as tightly as he could, feeling something inside him mend and break at the same time. "I thought you were gone," she cried. "I thought you died." Daniel pressed his forehead against hers. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm alive and I'm not going anywhere." But deep inside, he knew the truth. To keep that promise, he would have to face Richard. He would have to expose the betrayal. He would have to reclaim his life. And he would have to do it fast, because the moment Daniel ran into his arms, someone watching from afar lifted a phone and whispered, "We found him." Daniel held his daughter tightly, feeling her trembling against his chest, overwhelmed by emotions he didn't even know he could still feel. Daniel clung to him as if afraid he might disappear again if she let go. For a brief moment, the chaos of the world fell away. But the world never stayed quiet long for someone being hunted. Daniel noticed movement from the corner of his eye far at the edge of the parking lot, half hidden behind a dark SUV. A man raised a phone to his ear while staring directly at Daniel and Daniil. That was all it took to snap Daniel out of the fragile reunion. Everything inside him shouted move. He gently pulled Daniel back, brushing the tears from her cheek. "Sweetheart," he whispered urgently, "we have to go." Daniel blinked through her tears, confused. Why?" "I just found you, I know," he said, his voice strained, "but we were not safe here." Helen had already stepped out of the car, leaning on the door but watching the man by the SUV intensely. Ethan climbed out too, eyes wide as he tracked the figure making a call. Linda, still in the driver's seat, swore under her breath. "Damn it, they must have followed me earlier. We need to move now." Daniel looked between all of them, panic rising in her expression. "Dad, what's happening? Why are people following you? Where have you been?" Daniel wished he had time to answer. He wished he could sit her down and explain everything, but they had seconds, not minutes. "I promise I'll tell you," he said, gripping her shoulders, "but right now, if we stay here, we put everyone in danger, including you." Daniel's throat tightened. She nodded slowly, trusting him even without understanding. Linda jumped out of the car and opened the back door. "Get in, Daniel," she instructed. "We can talk later. We need to lose them." Danielle hesitated only long enough for Daniel to squeeze her hand before she hurried into the backseat beside Helen. Ethan rushed in after her. Daniel got into the passenger seat while Linda fired up the engine. She pulled out of the lot just as the man by the SUV began speaking urgently into his phone, stepping toward the exit. Linda didn't wait. She hit the accelerator, swinging the sedan sharply onto the main road. The tires screeched. Daniel yelped in surprise. Ethan's heart hammered, but he reached across the seat to steady her hand. Helen kept her eyes forward, though her breathing was tense. Daniel twisted around to look behind them. The man near the SUV was pointing in their direction. Seconds later, another black car peeled away from the far side of the lot. "They re on us," Daniel said. Linda didn't hesitate. "Hold on." She cut across 2 lanes of traffic, ignoring angry honks, and turned sharply down a side street. The pursuing car swung into the same turn, closing distance fast. Daniel's eyes filled with fear. "Dad, who are they?" Daniel clenched his jaw. "The people who tried to hurt me." Helen gripped the handle above her window. "And if they catch us, they will finish the job." Linda sped through downtown, weaving between cars, taking sudden unmarked side roads like someone who knew the city's back routes intimately. Daniel never realized she had this side to her, but he was grateful for it now. She took another sharp corner. The sedan behind them followed. They retrained, Linda muttered. "Not just hired muscle. They know how to tail." Ethan craned his neck to look through the window. "Can the police help?" Helen shook her head. "No police. If Richard has this much influence, he's got people in law enforcement. We can't risk calling anyone until we know who's clean." Daniel felt a painful truth sinking deeper. The man hunting him had resources, money, and connections. Daniel had been powerful too once, but without his company, wealth, or identity, he was outmatched. Still, he wasn't powerless. He had his mind, his memories returning, and people who cared about him. And that was enough to fight with. Linda made a sudden turn into an underground parking structure. The car dipped into the dim concrete levels. "We hide the car," she said, "then we run on foot out the other exit." She pulled into a spot near a concrete pillar and killed the engine. Everyone piled out quickly. Daniel clutched Daniel's arm. "Dad, what if they find us?" "They won't," he said, hoping he wasn't lying. They hurried across the structure toward a stairwell, footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Halfway there, Daniel heard the screech of tires entering the garage. The black sedan had followed. "Go," Daniel urged. They reached the stairwell and rushed down several flights until they spilled out into a service alley behind a row of old office buildings. The air was cold, scraping at their lungs. Linda pointed toward a small pedestrian street 2 blocks away. "If we make it there, we can disappear into the crowd." They ran. Helen's steps were slow, but Daniel supported her while still keeping pace. Daniel held Ethan's hand, terrified but trusting him. Behind them the garage exit door slammed open. Heavy footsteps echoed. "Keep moving," Daniel shouted. They sprinted across the intersection just as a wave of pedestrians stepped off a bus, blocking the view behind them. Linda guided them into the crowd expertly, weaving through people, pulling the group toward a cluster of food vendors. Daniel kept his head down, shielding Daniel. Ethan pulled his hood up, glancing back repeatedly. For several agonizing minutes, it was impossible to know whether they had lost the pursuers or whether danger lingered just outside the corner of his vision. Finally, Linda lay behind a row of delivery trucks, hidden from the main street. They ducked behind crates stacked against a brick wall. Linda checked the street again and let out a long exhale. "I think we lost them." Daniel pressed his back against the wall, breathing hard. Denial threw her arms around him again, shaking. "Dad, please tell me what's going on." Daniel cupped her face gently. "Someone betrayed me," he said, "and they don't want me alive to expose them. But I will protect you. I swear I will." Daniel bit her lip, trying not to cry. Helen rested a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You know what you need to do now," she said. "You have to confront him." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, I have to face Richard. But not alone." Linda stepped forward. "There's someone else who might help, one of the board members. Someone Richard can't manipulate easily." Daniel frowned. "Who?" "Thomas Avery," Linda said. "He always had respect for you, and he's the only person Richard couldn't bully." Daniel's memory flickered. An older man with a stern voice and firm handshake. A board member who prided himself on integrity. Someone Daniel had once confided in. Daniel straightened. "Then he's the one we go to." Ethan grinned faintly. "So we were going to take down the bad guy?" "Yes," Daniel said, gripping his daughter's hand tight. "But we'll have to be smarter than him, much smarter." As they moved out of the alley and prepared to meet Thomas Avery, Daniel felt something powerful rising inside him. Not fear, not confusion, but purpose. His life had been stolen from him, his company hijacked, his daughter endangered, his identity erased. But the people hunting him had made one critical mistake. They had let him live. And now Daniel Scott was done running. Now he was fighting back. Thomas Avery lived in a quiet, gated suburb outside Detroit, far from the chaos of the city and even farther from the corruption Daniel had been thrust back into. His home, a 2-story colonial with tall windows and a manicured lawn, looked exactly like the kind of place integrity might live, stable, composed, untouched by the vicious games of corporate betrayal. When Linda parked down the street, Daniel scanned the area carefully. There were no suspicious cars, no men in suits casually pretending to walk their dogs, no shadows lingering where they shouldn't be. Still, Daniel refused to take chances. He motioned for the group to stay low behind the hedges. Daniel stayed close to him, clutching his arm tightly. Helen and Ethan kept watch while Linda led them around the side of the house toward a narrow path lined with trimmed shrubs. "Thomas prefers people use the side door," she whispered. "He hates unexpected attention." Daniel almost smiled. That sounded exactly like the man he remembered, sharp, cautious, never one to overlook detail. They approached the side door and Linda knocked twice. Then once, a pattern Thomas used years ago for private meetings. Moments passed. Then the door opened a crack. A sharp, familiar eye peered through. Linda, deep voice asked, "Is that you?" "Yes," she whispered urgently, "and you need to let us in, now." The door opened wider, revealing Thomas Avery, older than Daniel remembered, with silver hair and lines deepened by years of responsibility, but still carrying the same authoritative presence. His gaze shifted from Linda to Daniel. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Thomas's mouth fell open slightly, his breath shaky as he whispered, "Daniel." Daniel stepped forward. "It's me, Thomas." The older man looked stunned, horrified, relieved all at once. "But I saw the reports. They said you were gone." Daniel shook his head. "I'm not, but I almost was." Thomas stepped aside instantly. "Inside, quickly. If anyone followed you, we don't have long." Once the door closed behind them, Daniel felt a weight lift slightly. Thomas's home smelled of polished wood and old books, the atmosphere calm despite the storm looming around them. Daniel held Daniel's hand, refusing to let go, and Thomas's eyes softened when he saw her. "Daniel," he said quietly, "your father loves you more than anything. I knew he wouldn't leave you willingly." Daniel nodded, wiping her tears. "He didn't. Someone tried to take him." Thomas motioned everyone toward his study, closing the door behind them. When he turned to face Daniel again, his expression became serious. "Tell me everything." Daniel recounted the events, awakening in the rail yard, losing his memory, being hunted, the slow return of fragmented memories, and the truth Linda had confirmed about Richard's betrayal. Thomas listened without interruption, occasionally pacing, occasionally nodding. When Daniel finished, Thomas's jaw tightened and anger simmered beneath his composed exterior. "I knew Richard was ambitious," Thomas said, "but I never imagined he would go this far. Embezzling funds was one thing, sabotage was another. But attempted murder, Daniel leaned forward. He wanted the company, he wanted control, and I was standing in his way. Thomas nodded grimly. That tracks. He's been consolidating power since your disappearance. But he made one mistake he'll regret now. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What's that? Thomas's eyes burned with conviction. He underestimated me, and he underestimated you. Thomas walked to a tall bookshelf and pulled out a locked case, retrieving a sealed envelope. Before you vanished, he said, you gave me this. You told me to hold it until you returned or until the board needed proof of Richard's corruption. Daniel stared at the envelope as if it were a relic from a past life. What's inside? Everything, Thomas said. Financial records. Messages, evidence Richard manipulated accounts and orchestrated private deals behind your back. Daniel felt breathless. Enough to bring him down. Enough to bury him, Thomas replied. The envelope felt heavy in Daniel's hands, but not just because of its contents. It was heavy with purpose, with justice he had nearly lost the chance to seek. However, Thomas wasn't finished. But taking him down with paperwork alone won't work anymore, he said. Not after he declared you dead. He'll claim you an imposter. He'll call you unstable. He'll weaponize the media before your voice reaches the public. Daniel's heart sank. Then what do we need? Thomas crossed his arms, thinking deeply. We need 3 things. Proof you alive. Proof he tried to remove you. And proof others were involved or aware. Daniel felt clarity ignite inside him. Amanda, he said. She knew something was wrong. She tried to stop me from confronting him alone. Thomas nodded. If we can get her safely away from Richard's surveillance, she can testify. Daniel trembled. Mom has been scared since Dad disappeared. She knew Richard was lying. Thomas placed a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder. Your mother is stronger than you think. And now that your father is back, she has something worth fighting for. Before anyone could speak again, a loud noise echoed from outside, a car door slamming. Thomas stiffened. Linda hurried to the window and peeked carefully, her face drained of color. Black sedan, she whispered. 2 men. They're reapproaching the side gate. Daniel clutched her father's arm again. Ethan froze. Helen's breath hitched sharply. Daniel stepped forward, suddenly steady and fearless. They know I'm alive. They know I'm moving. The only thing left is to confront them head on, but on our terms. Thomas nodded, eyes sharp. I'll handle them. Daniel, take your daughter, Helen, Ethan, and Linda through the back patio. There's a garden path that leads to the neighbor's property. They're out of town, so no one will see you. Daniel shook his head. I won't leave you alone to deal with them. Thomas smirked faintly. Son, I've dealt with men like Richard before. They're cowards who hide behind hired muscle. The knocking at the front door was loud and forceful. Open up! A voice barked. Linda's pulse quickened. Daniel clung tighter. Thomas grabbed Daniel's shoulder firmly. Listen to me. This is your chance. Get to Amanda. Get your truth out. Bring the evidence to the board. I will stall them long enough. Daniel hesitated only a second before understanding the gravity of Thomas's sacrifice. He nodded. Thank you for believing in me. Thomas smiled softly. You're the rightful leader of Skatek. Go take back what's yours. Daniel turned to his daughter. Stay close, he whispered. Daniel nodded fiercely. Helen grabbed Ethan's hand as Linda led them toward the back patio. Another round of pounding rattled the door. Thomas walked calmly to the foyer. Daniel glanced back one last time, watching the man who had once been his mentor prepare to face danger for him. Then Daniel and his small group slipped out into the garden path and disappeared into the shadows. For the first time since his world shattered, Daniel Scott felt something powerful rising inside him, not fear, not confusion, but determination bright enough to cut through every threat, every betrayal, every dark path ahead. He was done being the victim. He was reclaiming his name, his family, his life. And Richard had no idea that the man he tried to erase was coming back stronger than ever. The story of Daniel, Ethan, and Helen is ultimately a reminder that strength is not defined by wealth, power, or status, but by character, compassion, and the choices we make when the world falls apart. Daniel was once a man of influence, surrounded by luxury and authority, yet when everything was taken from him, his identity, his memory, his resources, he found himself completely dependent on 2 strangers who had almost nothing. And it was in that vulnerable state, stripped of every mask and comfort, that he discovered the true meaning of humanity. Ethan and Helen had no reason to help a man they didn't know, a man who seemed out of place in their broken neighborhood. But they acted out of kindness rather than calculation. Their decision shows that the purest form of generosity often comes from those who have the least to give. It demonstrates that compassion is not a transaction, it's a choice rooted in empathy, shared struggle, and the belief that every life has value, no matter how different it may seem. Daniel's journey shows that identity is more than memory. Even when he didn't know his name, didn't recall his past, his instincts still pushed him toward doing what was right. He protected Ethan and Helen, he risked himself to save Helen's life, and he refused to abandon them even when danger closed in. These actions reveal that who we are is built not only from the past we remember, but from the choices we make in the present. Daniel's courage wasn't born from his status as a CEO or the power he once held. It emerged from the empathy he gained while being vulnerable. His brush with death stripped away the arrogance and blind trust he once had in his social circle, forcing him to recognize that people outside of wealth, people like Ethan and Helen, often possess more integrity and resilience than those inside it. This contrast highlights an essential truth: privilege can blur judgment, but hardship sharpens it. In losing everything, Daniel gained perspective, humility, and a renewed sense of purpose. At the same time, Ethan's role in the story delivers a profound lesson about the power of innocence mixed with responsibility. Despite being only a child, he confronted dangers that would intimidate adults, carried burdens far heavier than his age should have allowed, and yet maintained a sense of hope strong enough to extend trust to a complete stranger. The world had not been gentle with Ethan, but it had not stolen his capacity to care. His instinct to help Daniel without expecting anything in return becomes the spark that sets the entire journey in motion. Ethan proves that empathy does not require age, wealth, or position, just a heart willing to act. His character stands as a testament to the idea that small acts of kindness can ripple outward, transforming lives in ways we cannot predict. Without Ethan, Daniel's life would have ended in that rail yard, and without Daniel, Ethan may never have seen a future beyond the poverty he was born into. Helen's presence teaches a different kind of wisdom. Her caution, forged from years of hardship, balances Ethan's innocence and Daniel's desperation. She understands danger intimately and recognizes how quickly the world can change. Yet even with her skepticism, she chooses to help Daniel. The choice of a woman who has lived through enough pain to know that turning someone away can haunt a conscience far longer than the risk of letting them in. Helen shows that kindness does not erase fear, it pushes through it. She also demonstrates the strength of humility. She never pretends to be a hero, never claims to be more than she is. And yet she becomes the emotional anchor that allows Ethan and Daniel to navigate a path filled with uncertainty. Her courage is quiet but immense, reminding us that leadership often comes in the form of steady guidance rather than dramatic action. Another major lesson from the story lies in the contrast between Richard's betrayal and the loyalty Daniel discovers in unlikely places. Richard represents how ambition without morality can corrupt completely. His willingness to eliminate Daniel, steal his company, and manipulate those around him shows the destructive power of greed disguised as competence. It is a warning about trusting people based purely on proximity or title. Daniel once believed that success meant surrounding himself with capable individuals, but he learned the hard way that character matters more than credentials. Trust must be earned, not assumed. And sometimes the people who stand by us in the darkest moments are not the ones from boardrooms and wealth, but the ones from humble homes with nothing to gain except the belief that doing what's right is worth the risk. Finally, Daniel's rise from the ashes of betrayal shows that resilience is not the absence of fear, it is the commitment to move forward despite it. His decision to reclaim his name, his company, and his life is not driven by vengeance alone, but by the need to protect the people who saved him: Ethan, Helen, Linda, and ultimately his daughter, Danielle. His fight becomes bigger than restoring his status. It becomes about restoring justice, safeguarding his family, and ensuring that those who tried to destroy him cannot harm others. Daniel learns that identity is not something handed to us, it is something we rebuild, piece by piece, through courage, truth, and the connections we choose to honor. In the end, the story teaches that family is not solely defined by blood. It is built through shared hardship, loyalty, sacrifice, and love. Ethan and Helen became Daniel's family long before he remembered his own, and Daniel became the ultimate reason for him to stand tall again. The narrative reminds us that we rise not because we are strong alone, but because we find strength in others, especially the ones who stand with us when they have nothing to gain. And as Daniel reclaims his life, the greatest lesson he carries with him is simple but profound: the most valuable parts of life are not the ones money can buy, but the bonds we form, the truth we fight for, and the hearts we choose to protect. If you found this content helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of my latest videos. If you have any ideas or topics you'd like me to cover, leave a comment below. I always read all your comments.